and we have to really escalate the noise we make so that we'll be heard.
Welcome to Gay USA. I'm Andy Humm.
And I'm Chris Cooper, sitting in for Ann Northrup and Brad Hoylman.
Thanks for being here.
My pleasure.
On this week's show, in the headlines, you all heard about the assault on Jussie Smollett, the outstar of TV's Empire, who was beaten in a racist and homophobic attack in Chicago.
But before we get to that, we are going to speak with our guest, New York State Assembly member Danny O'Donnell, about all the radical changes that have gone on in Albany, the New York State Capitol, since the Republicans were booted from control of the state Senate and replaced by Democrats.
And about his run for the public advocate of the city of New York, which is going to take place as a special election on February 26th. President Trump this week came out for Bible literacy being taught in schools, and he prayed with a whole bunch of anti-LGBT activists.
The city council speaker of New York, an out gay man, Cory Johnson, is exploring running for the mayoralty of New York City.
And like Chris, sometime co-host of Gay USA. In Hyattsville, Maryland, they got an out lesbian police chief.
South Dakota killed an anti-transgender bill.
And there's more turmoil in Brazil as an out Congress member has had to flee the country because of death threats.
Equally shocking, Japan's High Court has ruled that if you want to change officially your gender, you have to be sterilized.
It's outrageous. Guilty pleas in the murder of 8 Toronto men from a gay neighborhood.
And Andy will tell you about an out gay skater who won a national title.
We turn to our guest, Danny O'Donnell, longtime friend of Gay USA.
Pleasure to be here.
Welcome to be here. You have been in the State Assembly representing the West Side since 2002, and now you are one of 16 who are running for public advocate of the City of New York in a special election on February 26th to succeed Tish James, who's now our Attorney General. You are the only out gay candidate and the only, I believe, Irish candidate.
That is correct.
Okay. But can we start with state issues?
Absolutely.
All right. So I have always said, whenever I get the chance to come on the show, I always talk about how you can't vote for Republicans in legislatures, whether it's Congress or whether it's your state legislature, because the thing that matters is the body count. Whether there are more Republicans or more Democrats, and if there are more Republicans, it means everything we want doesn't get done. It gets bottled up, it gets killed before it can even come to a vote.
For the most part.
For the most part. All of a sudden, Albany, which for decades had a Republican majority, swept away in the last election, replaced with a Democratic majority, and boom, we get legislation after legislation after legislation that we have been waiting for so long. Tell us about some of the things that you guys have gotten done since now you're in the Assembly, but what this means is that the Assembly, which has long been democratically controlled in New York, now has a clear path to putting bills on the governor's desk. So tell us some of those things that got passed.
It's been a wonderful feeling to have a functioning Democratic progressive Senate as a partner to get things done. And usually we do nothing in the month of January. We just sit around, look at each other, and wonder when we're going to start. And now, because of the breathtakingly refreshing Andrea Stewart-Cousins, we are willing to...
Who is?
Who is the majority leader of the state Senate. She represents Yonkers. She's been there for about a decade or more. African-American woman.
And goddess.
And goddess, and just extraordinary leader. And she made a commitment that she was not going to play that game, that she was going to do the things that the people want. So we've finally passed the Reproductive Health Act. We finally passed GENDA. We finally passed...
GENDA is Transgender Rights Bill.
Transgender Non-Discrimination Bill. We finally passed the ban on conversion therapy. We finally passed the DREAM Act. We finally passed voting reforms in the state of New York. It's extraordinary what has happened in 2 weeks.
And how long? In 2 weeks. That's how long you've been in session.
Correct.
Now, let me ask you this. How many of those things had passed the Assembly previously, and for how long?
Well,
they had all passed the Assembly before. And something like gender has passed the Assembly for at least a decade.
At least a decade.
I mean, in terms of your record, I mean, you were the leader of the fight for same-sex marriage in the Assembly. I think you passed it how many times?
I passed it 5 times before we managed to get the Senate to go along.
And then finally, Governor Cuomo decided he would help out and make that happen in the state Senate on the Senate side. And was that a difficult or a close vote in the Assembly?
Well, you know, the world has changed. I talk to young gay people who don't even know there was a time when you couldn't get married, almost. When I started in 2007, with that. First, John and I were plaintiffs in the marriage lawsuit.
Slow down.
John and I were plaintiffs. My husband, John.
You know, I don't know if you can jump to this, but you want to put up a picture of them getting married, of Assemblymember O'Donnell being married there by the former Chief Judge of the State of New York, Judith Kaye, with John Banta, who you met in college in
1978. At Catholic University of America. They are very proud.
Although you graduated from George Washington.
Is that you guys there?
What's that picture from?
That is when we were 20, and that was John. We went to Lake George to visit his family.
That's you on the right?
That is me. That is me. Black hair and beard. There's no black hair left here, but that's us. And I thought I was fat. Look how skinny I was. Anyway, so we met the first day of college in 1978, and fairly shortly after we fell in love and became a couple, and we've been together since 1980. And so we were the plaintiffs in the marriage lawsuit here in New York. Yeah. Robbie Kaplan was our lawyer, and we lost there in the Court of Appeals, and they said, you have to go to the legislature. So in 2007, I became the author and sponsor of the marriage equality bill in the New York State Assembly. And please remember, at that point, polling on the subject was in the mid to high 30s. When I got the bill in April of that year, there were only 24 yes votes in our House. And God bless Deborah Glick and I, we tag teamed ourselves to death and managed to get...
Deborah Glick is an out lesbian assembly member. She's been there since 1991.
Right. She's the first openly gay politician in America, and I'm absolutely indebted to her for so many things, including the way we worked together to do this. And by the time we took the first vote in June, we had 85 votes for marriage. And we held on to that for the entire time until the Senate came along.
Clarifying, first out legislator in New York. There were many officials around the country.
Yes, in New York. Yes, in New York.
And also, just to clarify, these votes in New York were occurring before we got the Supreme Court ruling that basically opened up marriage to everybody.
Of course. This was when we finally passed marriage legislatively in New York. It means a whole bunch of different things, including the Supreme Court can't take it away because the legislature would have to take it away. And it also led the way to the Windsor case and the other cases. And it was the straw that broke the camel's back. Other states had, you know, limitations somehow. Anyone in the world could come into New York, and we had no residency requirement, we had no anything. If you came here, you had a right to a marriage license.
Now, of course, we would have had this, I think, in 2005 or so, when Justice Doris Lynn Cohan ordered the mayor of New York to do it, Mike Bloomberg, but he appealed to the Court of Appeals. People ought to remember this when looking at him as a presidential candidate, and stopped marriage for 6 years in New York.
That's correct.
I don't want to get off track with some of the other legislation, though. The Reproductive Rights Act, similarly, where you said the Supreme Court can't take away marriage now from New York State. Similarly, by passing the Reproductive Rights Act, isn't that sort of the idea behind that? Because we have reproductive rights in New York. We have it nationally from the Supreme Court.
Well, we have it nationally because of Roe v. Wade. And, you know, I come from an Irish Catholic family. My mother was the president of the Rosary Altar Society, and she was pro-choice pre-Roe v. Wade. Oh. And so I know that. She died shortly thereafter, but I do remember that. And it's absolutely important. It's integral to the gay rights movement, to be quite frank. It's the same thing. It's about control of your own bodies. And so with the troubling events in Washington and what's happening, the idea that someone could come along and say Supreme Court changes, we're going to not have Roe v. Wade, we now will have that in New York because of what we did this week.
Okay, more legislation. Gender, the Gender Expression Non-Discrimination Act. Again, this is the trans people are under attack from Washington, but here in New York State, there was already an executive order from Governor Cuomo protecting trans people. So why was gender so important?
Because executive orders can be undone by another governor. And the reality is one of the great failures of our movement has been our failure to include trans people in it and acknowledge their role in Stonewall and all movements forward. And so it was a shame that in 2002, before I joined the body, we passed SONDA without trans inclusion. When I passed the Dignity for All Students Act, it was the first time ever trans people were acknowledged in state New York.
And that is the anti-bullying
law that I wrote. That's correct. And so it's a long time coming, but I'm thrilled that we got there.
Well, we want to get to another big thing that happened this week. I think it's called the Child Protection Act.
Child Victims Protection Act.
Child Victims Protection Act.
Correct.
This is for people who were sexually abused as children and have not been able to do anything about it because they didn't want to do anything about it as they got older because they were ashamed and everything. And what does this bill do?
It opens up the statute of limitations to allow people who were previously victimized in their life, who the statute of limitations prevented them from seeking justice, and allows them to seek justice.
And it changes the statute of limitations, doesn't
Correct.
It changes. Do you have the details on that?
It changes it to a very, very big window. I think it goes up to the age of 55.
Right. It used to be 23.
Right. And so
now it's 55.
You know, if you know anyone who has been in that circumstance, who has fought hard to understand why they're in pain, and it takes them a long time, probably a lot of therapy, for them to really be able to do that, it's an absolute outrage that we prevented those people from seeking justice. And I have always been a sponsor of that bill. When the person who's really responsible is Marge Markey, and she was in the chamber, a former member of the assembly. She was in the chamber when we took the vote, and very moved. And she took a lot, she may have lost her seat because of it. And so she took a lot of flack from the Catholic Church because the Catholic Church was so afraid of the financial implications of this law, but she refused to back down. And I helped her on a number of occasions debating Vito Lopez, who was doing shilling for the Catholic Church. And so she was there, and it was a very moving moment.
All right, and this is a tremendous bill, and it's been, I think we've been for 15 years. So fighting for it for 15 years, and then on the Senate side, when they finally vote on it, it's 63 to nothing.
Well, that was like the Dignity Bill. The Dignity Bill was held up for years, and it was held up.
The anti-bullying.
The anti-bullying bill, because they came to me and said, if you just take the trans language out, we'll pass it tomorrow. And I don't compromise on equality and justice.
Well, when we passed the hate crimes bill, they want to take gays out.
Right.
And
so I said no, and it delayed it. And then when the vote was taken, there were only three votes no. Why did it take so long? So they were hoping I would fold on the trans community, and I refused to do that.
Okay, so
let's finish on the Senate side. It was out Senator Brad Hoylman led the fight on the Senate side,
right?
And we were supposed to be our co-host this week, but he's stuck up in Albany. So we're going to show his speech, part of it, from the floor of the Senate on this, talking about somebody who was a guest on Gay USA.
Senator Hoylman, to explain your vote.
Thank you, Madam President. I'm gratified by the widespread support on both sides of the aisle for the Child Victims Act. I guess I have to ask the question, as I explain my vote, what took you so long? But I'm very thankful that we have come as a body to recognize that we are gathered here for this historic opportunity to correct this longstanding injustice. As you know, Madam President, the survivors of child abuse have looked to Albany for justice for years, but their pleas have gone unanswered. And New York did the same thing, frankly, that other states had and other institutions did for years. The Senate postponed a reckoning and buried this legislation. People in power across the state have told our constituents, many of them abuse survivors, that this wasn't a real issue, that it was someone else's problem, it happened somewhere else, just not here. But no longer can we deny the truth. Child sexual abuse happens, sadly, everywhere. It happens in homes, and doctors' offices, schools and churches, sports teams, youth groups, scout troops, with trusted authority figures of all kinds. And that's one of the most insidious things about this crisis. that we're trying to confront today, the trust that is often built between an abuser and the survivor. We've spoken to many of the survivors here. I know they've met with so many of us over the last several years. And they tell us time and time again about how that trust was developed, how the process of grooming contributes to that insidious relationship. And how can you blame a child who doesn't understand their sexuality, who doesn't know what might be different or correct given their age and inexperience? And we think about survivors like Michael Meenan, who was abused by his parish priest over the course of years. The priest befriended his family, officiated his older sister's wedding, and baptized her children. He also took Michael out on dozens of overnight trips. He plied Michael with alcohol, and he abused him. The priest continued to serve as an auxiliary bishop for decades until Michael spoke out. But that wasn't Michael's only experience. Shortly after he graduated from high school, he was at a party with some of his fellow students. They went back to a student's home to sleep. One of Michael's teachers drove him to the party and abused Michael while he slept. I shared that story because I had met Michael when I first took up this bill. And in our discussion, I tried to console him. And he said, "Senator, that's not the worst part of my story." And I said, what could be worse? Somebody violating your trust, the trust of your family. He said, "Senator, that teacher is still at my high school, 33 years later." And that's what we seek to address with the Child Victims Act. Not only are we flinging open the courthouse doors for survivors to finally be heard before a jury of their peers, but thanks to their persistence and activism, thanks to their articulate description of this pervasive problem, they will help us identify predators like Michael's teacher, who still may be in contact with children.
If you don't mind, put Michael's picture up. He was a guest on the show, and he was one of the leaders. He was one of the faces of this thing. Do we have that picture that we can show? There he is. He was on Gay USA talking about this. A great journalist, by the way, as well. Worked with us at Gay City News, New York One, the New York Times, et cetera. And a great victory for the state.
So, Danny, let me ask you, all these things that happened in the last two weeks, and I understand also just we're past more gun control.
Correct.
So gun control, reproductive rights, gender, protecting trans people, the Child Protective Act, all that happened in 2 weeks.
The DREAM Act.
And the DREAM.
And the DREAM Act.
And the DREAM Act. Okay, so all these things passed in 2 weeks, and they've been bottled up for years.
Yes.
Literally, in some cases, decades. So what's the difference now that has made all this happen? I just want to underline the point.
We have an active, progressive, Democratic Senate that wants to do the right thing for the people.
And how do you get a Democratic Senate?
You elect them.
Yeah.
You work to elect them.
Elect Democrats.
Elect
specifically.
Democrats,
So,
yes.
so even if there's like a guy who's a Republican and he supports all our issues, if you vote for him, that's not going to do it.
No, because the Republicans hid behind their leaders. There's some very decent Republicans in the Senate. Some of them are my friends. But the reality is when push came to shove, they do what their leader tells them to.
Well, we see what happens in the United States Senate dominated by Republicans, mostly from small states.
Right.
It's not Democratic in that
Right.
small d. And all of our stuff is bottled up and we had the shutdown. Let's get to the fact that you're running for the public advocate of the city of New York now.
That's correct.
This is the #2 spot in New York. This is the successor to the mayor if the mayor is incapacitated or
And it
dies
served
or
as a
everything.
launching pad for the mayoralty of
Bill de
Blasio and for the attorney generalship of Tish James here in
Right.
New York. So it's a significant
So
position.
there's a special election on February 26th. There are 16 people running, 17 people on the ballot. That's hard to explain. how, I mean, somebody could win with 10% of the vote.
That's true.
So how, you know, and then whoever runs has to run again in the fall. But talk. Why this office? What do you want to do for the city?
Well, I never wanted this office, but in the last 2 years, we have seen encroaching executive power at all levels of government. And in the city of New York, we have somebody, a public advocate, whose job is to keep an eye on what's happening in the city and be the advocate for the people. And so I've been an advocate my whole life. I was a public defender for 7 years in Brooklyn. Then I went and joined Community Board 9 in West Harlem and fought over development there. Then I became a member of the New York State Assembly, becoming the first openly gay man elected there, and I've served there for 16 years. So I'm running on my record, not on rhetoric. I'm running on with the commitment to not run for mayor, because one of the problems with the job is that everyone does it as a stepping stone. And if you're doing it as a stepping stone, you lose credibility for what you're doing. People say, oh, he's just doing that to try to get attention. So I'm committed to not running for mayor, and I'm committed to make sure that we have an independent person running, because I have no ties to the mayor, I have no ties to the governor, I didn't endorse the governor for re-election. I do not serve as a party official, I'm not a member of the DNC, I'm not a district leader or a state committee, I'm not any of those things.
All right.
So I'm outside that structure.
So, I mean, you know, this is an LGBT show for the most part,
Yes.
you know, and we're concerned about all issues, but in terms of the LGBT issues that are still outstanding in the city of New York, I mean, we have an anti-bullying law, but bullying in the schools, the atmosphere in the schools is still hard for LGBT youth, homeless LGBT youth. Do you have any big ideas about addressing some of these things?
Yes, I have a number of big ideas about these things. First of all, I think that 50 years after Stonewall, it's about time that we have either a borough-wide or city-wide openly gay elected official. We've not had one.
That's true.
And
Have some people in the closet.
well, that's true. I can't speak to them. I've not been there in a long time, Andy, so that's not me. Secondly, for example, the governor and the state claims that we are going to be in 2020 AIDS free. That's what they claim. And yet we really don't know whether or not we're on target to do that. So one of the first task forces I intend to set up is an AIDS 2020 task force to bring all the treatment and testing organizations together and say, is this really on track? And if there's a spike of infections someplace, why is that, and who is best able to address that in that community? Remember, the days are very different in terms of how we provide those services. And are all those organizations getting the full amount of funding they are entitled to from the city, state, and federal government? Somebody has to look at that if we're going to be AIDS-free in a year. The second thing is the trans community is the most oppressed community in our society. I intend to hire a trans person to be a relationship with that community to make sure that we are protecting them and set up a task force on hate crimes so that we can look at that from a citywide perspective. When you look at what happened to my friend Jussie in Chicago, Jussie, if you're listening, I love you, get better. The reality is that we don't do enough to protect our community. And because of the level of hatred out of Washington, D.C., we see that. My family was subject to a death threat last summer at my home and my sister's home, and it was all because we're gay. And so in a way that was not tolerated 5 years ago, that somebody would call someone's private home phone number and say horrible things about what they intend to do to me, that has become part of what is allowed. And so we have to be loud and stand up and say we're not going to take that.
You just have the one lesbian sibling?
I have one lesbian sibling, and I have straight siblings too. I'm one of 5.
Okay.
So
Let's take a step back, because we do have a national audience,
Yes.
and talk a little bit about the fact that in running for public advocate, you're facing such a crowded field of 16 Democrats. What can we
there are 15 Democrats. One's a Republican.
One's a Republican and could win if a Republicans all turn out.
I try not to think
Everybody's running without party label, though.
I try not to think
What
about
are you
those
listed
things.
as?
Equality for all. That's
Equality
who
for all.
Oh, that's right. You all have to invent your own party
Right.
names.
That's
Okay.
mine.
All right. So you're running in a very crowded field.
Yes.
Mostly Democrats. How do you plan to differentiate yourself without cannibalizing each other and tearing each other up? And I ask because we're going to be facing the same thing in the presidential election come 2020, when we're going to have a dozen Democrats likely, or something close to that, running for the presidency. More. And how are they going to distinguish themselves without tearing each other apart. How do you plan to do that in the public advocate race?
One, I don't intend to cannibalize anyone or speak ill of anyone on the campaign trail. Two, I'm running on a record of accomplishment, 16 years in the state assembly. I've accomplished great things, including passing the Marriage Equality Act. I like to joke I'm the only member of the state legislature ever to have his picture on the cover of the New York Times, not in handcuffs, which is true. I have experience doing the work that the advocate would need to do. So, for example, Vito Lopez was a sexual harasser and has sexually harassed his female staff members. I was the chair of the ethics committee, and I was appointed to investigate that. I conducted an investigation within 6 weeks in full compliance with EEOC. I used the subpoena power that I had to get to the bottom of it, and then we threw the book at Vito Lopez. So I'm unwilling to stay, even when people said, we will never do that to a fellow colleague. If it's the right thing to do, I have a record of doing it. And I'm going to talk about my record. I'm going to talk about what I've done. I come from a loudmouth family. I should own that. The job should be a loudmouth, and that's me.
Okay. And the election is on February 26th, a Tuesday?
Correct.
Okay. Anybody can vote, no matter what party you're in.
That's correct.
Everybody votes. It's an open election. To finish this off, to distinguish yourself, why don't you tell me, who's the most surprising supporter you've gotten in this race?
I have supporters in all 5 boroughs, which almost none of my colleagues who are running can claim. I have Charlie Rangel is endorsing me, and Keith Wright is endorsing me from Harlem, and Assemblymember Inez Dickens from Harlem, and State Senator Robert Jackson from Harlem have all endorsed me. Obviously, Deborah Glick has endorsed me, Assemblymember Kathy Nolan from Queens.
And Ken Sherrill, the first openly gay elected official in the state of New York as a district leader in 1977.
And my constituent, so I'm very proud of that. So I have roots in all 5 boroughs. I was born in Queens, even though I was raised on Long Island, and I am going out and telling my story. And New York City saved my life because they opened a law school in 1983 that I could go to. And in 1980, it wasn't safe to be a gay person in many places in America. And John and I came here and we were.
Okay. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much.
February 26th is the primary. Thanks for all the work in Albany, and I hope more to come, especially for tenants.
I'm all in favor of that.
Last week, I was trying to talk about trans troops, and we used to have don't ask, don't tell. Mm-hmm. Well, I couldn't remember the rest of it.
Don't pursue.
Don't pursue. And
I
somebody
was
else
screaming
said,
at my
there was
television
also,
set as you guys were, I'm like, don't pursue,
well,
don't pursue.
And it's also don't harass. So thanks to the viewer who filled me in on that. And speaking of trans troops, the new Quinnipiac poll says that 70% of Americans say transgender people should be able to serve, and only 22% oppose that. So that's something. But let's go to this story, this horrible story of violence.
We are very sorry to be able to say that anti-gay and anti-black hate crimes now has a celebrity face in the face of Jussie Smollett, who many of you may know if you watch Empire. The sort of dynasty with black people is how I like to think of it.
And he plays an out gay character on that show.
He plays an out gay man playing an out gay character.
Yes.
He plays Jamal Lyon, the middle Lyon brother. There are 3 brothers on the show in this talented musical recording family, and he plays the gay brother, the middle brother.
Now, by the time you watch this is such a big story, you may know much more about it, but apparently coming out of a bar at 2 o'clock in the morning, a gay bar at Chicago, they put a hood over his head.
2 guys apparently assaulted him. They didn't put a hood over his head. I think what they put a rope around his neck.
Right.
They poured an unidentified liquid over his head.
Might have been bleach.
Might have been bleach. There's a lot of confusion about some of the details of the reports. Like, were they wearing MAGA hats when they did this? That's one of the rumors. We don't know for sure.
I mean, Jussie himself came out in 2015 on The Ellen Show, officially. He said he'd always been out, but he's the son of a Jewish father and an African-American mother who were both civil rights activists themselves. Cory Booker decried the attack and called for a passage of the federal anti-lynching bill, which is being held up because it includes LGBT people.
At this point, we're taping on a Wednesday afternoon. We don't have any sort of update on what his condition is, though he did take himself to the hospital, so that is hopefully a good sign.
And then over the weekend in Philadelphia, 4 men and one woman jumped out of a car and beat a 50-year-old customer coming out of a someplace called the Roasted Walnut in the neighborhood in Philadelphia. They were shouting anti-gay slurs. Other people from the restaurant came to the aid of this man, and the assailants fled.
Well, continuing the unfortunate crime news, last Thursday, 24-year-old black trans woman known as Pinky in Texas, in Houston, was shot dead, point-blank range in front of a gas station, a Chevron station, at 11 a.m. in the morning on a busy intersection.
I didn't realize that she died.
No, I'm sorry, you're right.
Shot several times
point-blank range.
Right.
There is no update on her condition.
And they have film of this. It's online. You can see this guy chasing her and gunning. Unbelievable.
Yeah.
All right. Let's go back to Mr. Trump. By the way, we're on the 2nd anniversary of his Muslim ban, and one of the things we've learned about that is that the Supreme Court said, oh, it's okay, people can still apply for waivers and things. Virtually no waivers have been granted on this. 98% have been denied of people who need waivers to get into the country for asylum and everything else. It's just, or even just to visit the country. They're just not doing it. It's a disgusting. And this was the week that he called for Bible literacy classes, that this should be taught in the schools. And you know what? I'm for that. Teach people about the vengeful God of the Bible. Teach people, about all the nonsense that's in there, if you actually teach it as an academic subject.
Well, meanwhile, Trump is meeting with an extreme hard right group led by, as if this isn't a conflict of interest, Ginny Thomas, the wife of Supreme Court Justice, or as we like to call him in my household, Uncle Clarence Thomas, to talk about, basically this group is extremely anti-gay, and they're having a meeting with Trump, and this is the wife of a sitting Supreme Court justice.
And apparently they started the meeting off with a prayer, and this made him very uncomfortable because he is a spawn of Satan, and this probably gave him hives or something like that. Oh my God. You can't make this stuff up. It is so grotesque what we're living through. I know it's very painful for all of you. Thank you for watching the show and putting up with it. And then I read this week that the United States has once again pulled out of UNESCO, which is the United Nations Education, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. They protect heritage sites, but they're all dedicated to world peace and all these things. But no, we're out of it again. I think the last time we left was under under Reagan we pulled out, and then we rejoined in 2003 under Bush, of all people.
We're a little back and forth with trans news today, but the CDC put out a report about how nearly 2% of high school students identify as transgender, and 27% of them feel unsafe at the school or traveling to and from the school. 35% are bullied at school, and 35% attempt suicide. Well, none of this I think is particularly shocking to us, but it's good to have this coming from a respected organization, government organization, the CDC.
So good and bad news on that front. In South Dakota, a committee in the legislature killed a bill that would have barred students from participating in sports consistent with their gender identity. Killed it in committee 5-2.
But sadly, in North Dakota, they killed a bill that would have granted employment non-discrimination protections to LGBT, well, I don't know about the T, but LGB people in North Dakota. And what's interesting about that law, and we'll talk about this in Florida as well, is that it seems not to have included public accommodations from the get-go. And that, I think, is going to be the new sort of frontier in our fighting for non-discrimination laws, is people fighting over whether public accommodations are included or not, because that's what's happening in Florida.
Well, because they're nervous about like bakers and printers and all this kind of stuff, and it is controversial. I mean, there's a printer who, where was that doesn't want to do printing of a gay brochure for an organization, right? And actually, printers have never had to print what they don't want to print. Obviously, you come to them with a porno book and you say, I'd like you to print this, and they say, I don't do that. You're allowed to say I don't want to do that. So it's harder to prove discrimination. They have sort of a right to discriminate on the basis of content. We've always tried to distinguish that with the wedding cakes, because you sell wedding cakes to non-gay people, you got to sell them to gay people.
Well, I think that ambiguity is what has allowed this issue to gain some traction with the populace and put public accommodations in this difficult position. The thing is that, public accommodations, if you go into a restaurant, you don't want to be refused service because, say, you're trans. But that is what trans people in particular are afraid of, the omission of public accommodations from these laws, and that's what's happening in Florida, where 2 different laws have been introduced, and one of them, Equality Florida, their main rights group for us, opposes vehemently because it omits public accommodations. It was introduced by a Republican state legislator who thinks that after 10 years of introducing the full Monty of LGBT protections, that this is the way to go now to get some progress. And Equality Florida and other groups like HRC and NGLTF are totally opposed to the exclusion of public accommodations. I gotta say I agree with them. And one of the arguments is that it particularly hurts trans people.
And it's very hard to get these things passed if you wait and say, well, we'll go for that later when people have calmed down. Because in New York, when we passed SONDA with the Sexual Orientation Non-Discrimination Act, everybody said, oh, well, we'll go for the trans later. Well, it took until now, from 2002 until 2019, to protect transgender rights.
Yeah.
All right. By the way, in Maine, Susan Collins has a trans opponent for 2020, Danielle Van Helsing, 36, who was the second to announce against Susan Collins, who got Brett Kavanaugh on the bench. This trans candidate says it is a horrifying time for trans people. Okay, in Iowa, the state Supreme Court is going to decide on whether Iowa Medicaid ban on transition-related care is constitutional. The case was heard this week, and a lower court judge ruled with us.
Meanwhile, Lambda Legal has condemned the Trump administration's attempt to allow discrimination in foster care. They've been trying to get religious objections allowed in foster care, and Lambda Legal is fighting them on it.
Well, in New York, there are groups. There's a group, a guy who's Orthodox Jewish, says he's a therapist, but he wants to be able to do conversion therapy. So he's suing New York. Now, in New York City, unlike the state, we don't just ban it for minors, for children. We ban it for everybody. We call it consumer fraud.
If you're paying for it.
Yeah, if you're paying for it. So this guy wants to be able to get reimbursed for doing his hateful work. And he says, well, I'm a religious counselor. I have to it's my free speech rights or something to be able to do this. Well, go ahead and do it if you're a religious counselor, but don't ask to be reimbursed by insurance or by the state or by Medicaid. That's the...
Well, the specifics in the Lambda case is that the Trump-Pence administration is granting special permission to a federally funded child welfare contract agencies in South Carolina.
It's outrageous.
Yeah.
Outrageous.
And they're allowed to discriminate against us with our tax dollars.
Well, back in New York City for a moment, Cory Johnson, a sometime co-host on this show. We have Cory's picture there that we can show. I think there he is. Who's he with there? He recently did the show as the co-host. He's the Speaker of the City Council, and now he's formed an exploratory committee for mayor. And the big thing is, he says, I'll only take $250 contributions at the most, even though you can do $2,000. I'm not taking any real estate money. I'm not taking any lobbyist money. That's bold.
Okay, but full disclosure, the matching funds that the city gives you only match if you take donations up to $250.
All right, but but still saying I won't take any money from real estate. What else is there in New York? And anyway, so
if he were to win, and
the race is not until 2021.
Right. So if Danny O'Donnell, our guest who was just here, does not win the public advocate role, though we wish him all the best, then if Cory Johnson were to win, he would become the first citywide elected openly gay official. We almost had one when Christine Quinn ran for.
That's true, and of course Ed Koch never came out and denied what he was all the way along. And in Maryland, they have now, and we have a picture of her, an out lesbian police chief. Her name is Amal Awad, 27-year veteran of the force, and she is committed to community policing. How about some national news? How about that Howard Schultz?
Oh, don't get me started.
The guy from Starbucks trying to run an independent campaign. People, you know, if we had a reasonable taxation in this country, these people would not have $1 billion like Bloomberg and this guy to spend on a political campaign because they'd be taxed at a reasonable rate and we would have reasonable public services, et cetera.
But that's not the issue with his running. The issue with his running is that he has a strong potential to split the anti-Trump vote, thereby allowing Trump to waltz into the presidency for a second term.
I think that our people out there are smart enough to know that one of two people is going to be president. It's either going to be a Democrat or Republican, unless this guy does fantastically well in the polls. But by the time you go to the polls, you're going to know it's going to be one of two people. Make a choice.
Yeah, I think he can siphon off just enough in key states, because that's what happened in Florida.
Kamala Harris declared this week, certainly integrated LGBT. She's a senator from California, integrated LGBT issues into her announcement.
Meanwhile, there's
said she was for Medicare for all. It was a very hard left speech coming from someone who, was not, didn't have a whole history on that. But this is why Howard Schultz says he's running, because he thinks the Democrats are too hard left. But we've never had a progressive, real leftist government in America, ever, really, not really.
Meanwhile, there is rumor that Tulsi Gabbard's campaign is in disarray.
Well,
she is
a
Hawaiian who used to campaign against us and against our rights for same-sex marriage, and then offered a tearful, heartfelt apology.
It was nice to see that the vice chair of the House Oversight Committee is the out bisexual Katie Hill of California. She's married to a man, but she's out about being bisexual, and she will be a big force in the investigations of Donald Trump. Okay. And there's a Trump nominee for the Federal District Court of Texas. We should not overlook these things. David Kaczmarek, history of opposing LGBT rights, and questions the very existence of trans people.
Meanwhile...
What is he, a Catholic bishop?
Meanwhile, as the 50th anniversary of Stonewall approaches, prominent LGBTQ activists are endorsing the Reclaim Pride Coalition's non-corporate grassroots march for human rights. Andy, can you tell us something about this?
Well, I mean, Ann Northrup and I are working very hard on this with many, many, many other people who are trying to have a civil rights march on June 30th, which is the commemoration of Stonewall. The Heritage of Pride is still going to have their parade, which will take 9 hours. Ours will take about 2.5, 3. We're going to march from the village through the traditional route, going up 6th Avenue. This is the first route, up to Central Park, have a rally, listen to some speakers. And if you still want to go down and join the parade, which they are now calling a march, you can. Well, you can.
Well, you'll be happy to know that
Larry Kramer is endorsed, Chelsea Manning, lots of new endorsements.
My very corporate employer's Pride group is having a meeting to organize for Stonewall 50 right after I leave here, and I'm going to tell them, oh yeah, I think it's nice that you're having your corporate march, but I'm sorry, I'll be in the Reclaim Pride
Well, they can march. Anybody
march.
can march with us. You can't have corporate floats, though.
Right.
That's the thing. It slows everything down, and it's advertising.
But that's what they're talking about. They're talking about having a corporate float, and I'm going to be like, that's good. You guys do that in the regular march. I'll be in the Reclaim Pride march.
Not all corporations like us. In Texas, a gay male couple was denied a use of a place called The Venue for their wedding celebration. There is no law protecting them down there from this kind of discrimination. This is a place north of Dallas. In Virginia, now you said Republicans never do anything, but the bill protecting LGBT rights in housing and public employment passed the Senate and now has cleared the House of Delegates Rules Committee for the first time.
Yeah, as I understand it, there were 3 different LGBTQ bills, of which 3 were forwarded. 1 was, ditched because it was repetitive of some of the others. But unfortunately, I don't think there's a lot of hope for them to actually pass.
Oh, really?
Yeah, that's the analysis.
All right. Well, the Commonwealth of Virginia. I went to the University of Virginia. It is a very backward state, but it's making progress. There's going to be a national trans visibility march on April the 1st, but sponsored by Gilead, the pharmaceutical company. Are you kidding?
But it may not be April the 1st, because now they're talking about moving it to March 31st, the day before, because April the 1st, besides being April Fool's Day, is also a Monday. And for some reason, they didn't think that planning it for a Sunday was better, would get better attendance, so now they're thinking about moving it back. They will make a decision by, I think, February 7th.
Get rid of Gilead, because now you have people from Chuck Grassley, the Republican from Iowa, to all the many of the Democrats speaking up and saying we've got to get pharmaceutical prices under control, but they never do anything about this.
Well, Gilead was also, I think, a sponsor. They were a sponsor of the Creating Change, NGLTF's Creating Change conference that just finished up in, I think, last week.
With its usual controversy.
With its usual controversy.
All right.
Are we going to talk about the controversy?
No, there was a
we'll
big
see.
anti-Israel protest there, as there has been for the last couple of years, by a group called Cancel Pinkwashing. This was held January 23rd to the 27th in Detroit. And people, it's a long story. You can read about it online. And there was that, I mentioned the print shop story. Okay.
Shall we get to international?
Well, I want to mention the death of Bobby Swan, 88, a transgender pioneer in drone technology. Bobby died at the age of 88. Didn't go fully didn't have confirmation surgery until the age of 72 in Thailand. She called hers a slow transition. But she lived in Clinton Township, Michigan. She is survived by 2 sons and 5 grandchildren. But she initiated a lot of the drone technology in wartime to, do surveillance during the Vietnam War and other times. Okay. You mentioned Pinky, the CDC. In Massachusetts, for the first time, they moved a trans inmate from a men's prison to a women's prison, a 54-year-old inmate. San Francisco has designated an area of the Tenderloin as a transgender cultural district. This is where the Compton's cafeteria rebellion happened in 1966, mostly by trans people. So that's there. And in Indiana, they have a bill to bar students from using the restroom aligned with their gender identity. Indiana, come on. Mike Pence is... All right, international.
International. Japan Supreme Court, what were you thinking? They decided that you have to actually be sterilized if you want to change officially your gender identity.
Update your documents.
Yeah, and it was a unanimous decision on their part. Basically they said that the law 111, is designed to prevent problems, quote unquote, in relationships between parents and children.
It requires a trans person to be single and have no children under 20 in order to accomplish this full transition.
They fear it could result in confusion, quote unquote, and abrupt changes across Japanese society. The one ray of light in this decision was that they did say that the legislation was invasive and that it should be revisited as views change and as society changes.
Progress in the United Kingdom. A same-sex couple was finally offered in vitro fertilization for the first time by the NHS, the National Health Service, which had banned surrogacy up until now.
That's something we forgot to ask Danny O'Donnell about, is whether he would support updating New York's laws on surrogacy.
I imagine he will. That's also a bill being pushed by Brett Hoylman in the Senate. In Melbourne, gay activist Tony Pittman plans to boo the Liberal Party. Now, the Liberal Party there is the Conservative Party. In the Midsummer Pride March that's taking place, so he's... inviting people to help him boo the participation of the Liberal Party in a gay march.
Meanwhile, the openly gay Brazilian congressman, the one openly gay Brazilian congressman, I'm going to mangle a lot of the names here. I'm sorry, I'll apologize in advance because I don't know the Portuguese pronunciations.
Okay.
But the congressman is named João Willis, W-Y-L-L-Y-S.
Yes.
And he is so afraid for his life because he has been an outspoken opponent of the new very right-wing, very anti-gay President Bolsonaro.
Well, he did spit on him during a debate 2 years ago when Bolsonaro was being a particular pig, which he still is.
So he fears for his life. So so he's left and he's not going back.
Bolsonaro gave an interview to Bloomberg News. Oh, I'm not anti-gay. I have gay friends. What are you talking about? You said you'd kill one of your kids if you found out he was gay.
Well, but here's the kicker. His post is being filled, since he's not going back, by another gay man. This gay man is David Miranda, who is the husband of Glenn Greenberg, the very famous...
Glenn Greenwald.
Sorry, Glenn Greenwald, the very famous reporter.
They're the ones who broke... With David Miranda, they helped break the WikiLeaks story, Edward Snowden.
Exactly.
They did that story with him. There was a whole documentary about that. There was a feature film about that. So yes, very brave of David, who's already a Rio City Council member, to stand up and become an out gay member of Congress. because, another of his colleagues in the Rio City Council we told you about last year, Marielle Franco, was murdered in the streets by the Bolsonaro crowd.
I mean, as bad as things are getting here under Trump, things are getting bad there in Brazil under Bolsonaro.
But at the Russian embassy in London, because of all this crap with Chechnya, they wrapped it in a rainbow flag. Look at that. This was to stand up for the people in Chechnya over the weekend. About 100 people showed up, including Peter Tatchell. Called on the UK government to raise the issue at the highest levels because what's happening in Chechnya is outrageous. The St. Petersburg LGBT network submitted a complaint to what's the FBI of Russia saying you've got to look into this. Now, some people think that's naive, but they've got to start somewhere, and they're trying.
Now, I put this under international news because they are a sovereign nation. I'm just going to mention it really quickly, but it's a lovely story if you can look it up. It's from NPR about LGBT Navajos and how they actually bond with their grandparents who were never inculcated with Western homophobia, and they're perfectly fine with their kids being gay and support them. And so that's that interesting leapfrog of generations, and they're connecting. So it's just a lovely NPR story. Look it up if you can find it, and give it a read.
And in the we're getting down here. In the United Kingdom, the House of Lords is going to debate a bill February 1st for same-sex marriage in Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland hasn't had essentially a government convening for the last 2 years because they can't make a deal on how they're going to run things. So the Lords are moving forward, and then you'd have to pass it in the House of Commons.
The clause in the Lords would make it legal if within 6 months there wasn't a government constituted within Northern Ireland to decide otherwise.
Because Northern Ireland's the only part of the United Kingdom, United Kingdom that doesn't have same-sex marriage still.
In Iran, they publicly hanged a guy for being gay. 31-year-old, they said, and it's very hard to know the truth of these stories. Journalists can't get at them, can't find out what really happened.
Well, they say it's on charges of sexual intercourse with another man, but then they also accused him of kidnapping 2 15-year-olds. Again, you can't know the facts. I think they tack on some of these other charges to make it more palatable to Westerners, seeing these horrible hangings that they do in the streets of Iran.
The bottom line is
homosexuality.
If you're gay and you're living in Iran, you're living in terror.
And in Brazil, going back to Brazil, a deranged killer had sex with a trans woman, Cory da Silva, then ripped her chest open and pulled out her heart. He told authorities that da Silva was a demon. Well, where do you get that idea? Oh, it's just so disheartening and disgusting.
All right,
we better give them some better news before this show is over.
All right, well, 2 quick notes from Asia. In Singapore, their gay sex ban is facing a legal challenge based on the legalization of gay rights in India.
Yeah.
So using that rationale, because they're all part of the Commonwealth, they're able to tap into their shared legal precedents.
The Commonwealth is good for something.
Exactly. And then there's going to be an 8th Asia Conference of ILGA, the International Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Trans, and Intersex Association in Seoul, South Korea in August. For those of you who want to register.
All right. Okay.
Shall we?
All right. In AIDS news, at the UK Teen Tech Awards, a 13-year-old and 2 14-year-olds won the top prize for a new condom that could detect STIs. By changing color. It's only an idea. They haven't, but they won a prize for it.
Wow.
All the kinks have not been worked out.
Meanwhile, in California, a state senator has introduced a bill that would make PrEP, pre-exposure prophylaxis, available without a doctor's prescription.
Where's this going to be?
This is in California.
Maybe we can get Danny O'Donnell to introduce that in New York as well.
There you go.
That would be nice. Okay, I think emergency PEP, if you've had an exposure, and is available at pharmacies in New York. An emergency dose of that as well. Okay. Entertainment news.
Entertainment news. Supergirl. I am an old comic book hand. I used to work at Marvel Comics. Supergirl is DC Comics, the other company, the distinguished competition.
Okay.
But the bottom line is that Supergirl introduced the first transgender superhero for television, and it was awesome. I watched it last night. I thought it was somewhat nuanced for superhero shows that aren't always known for their nuance.
Even though Black Panther won the SAG Award, SAG-AFTRA Award from my union.
Fantabulous. I love the fact that they won. They deserved it. But yeah, there's a character named Nia who is a dreamer. She has dream powers. She sees the future, and she has joined the cast of Supergirl, and she'll be a semi-regular.
And playing a gay character is still, or a lesbian character, or trans?
But the actress herself is trans.
Right. I was going back to the SAG-AFTRA Awards.
Oh, I see.
Rami Malek won for Best Actor for Bohemian Rhapsody. Mahershala Ali for Supporting Actor for Green Book. These are all gay characters. Darren Criss for Gianni Versace, the assassination film, and Sandra Oh for Killing Eve won. So, and that's for television.
You're going to have to tell me what the premise of Killing Eve is.
I don't know. I haven't seen it. Anne recommends it very highly.
Okay.
GLAAD would not nominate Bohemian Rhapsody because of all the problems with Bryan Singer, the director, who was up on all these charges, big expose. Where was it written? Anyway, on all of his sexual misconduct with underage guys, which he continues to deny. An awful lot of stories.
Which is unfortunate because I'm a big fan of his X-Men movies.
And he was the director of Superman. Now, in skating, well, first of all, you had the first out bisexual and gay dancing team that competed, but that couple, Corinna Monta and Joe Johnson, they finished 7th. But the national pairs title was won by an out gay named Timothy Leduc, whose partner is Ashley Kane.
Fantastic.
Yes. Choir Boy is extended to March 10th on Broadway.
I saw it.
Show.
I enjoyed it. It's an interesting...
Right, we saw it together.
Duh, of course.
I always forget who I saw.
I do the same thing, so now I don't feel bad. Thank you.
What else? And we're almost out of time, but the Super Bowl is in Atlanta this week.
You're asking me?
All right. An out former Falcon player, Esra Tualo, out gay guy, hosted earlier a Hate is Wrong inclusion panel for LGBTQ athletes, coaches, and allies. And it's part of his Hate is Wrong nonprofit group. And, he's still continuing that kind of work.
And, of course, there's the organization Athlete Ally, which is all about athletes standing up for gays and lesbians participating in sports.
Right. And I think we have another minute. Speaking of Black Panther, which, won for Best Ensemble at the SAG-AFTRA Awards, Michael B. Jordan, who plays the heavy in the movie?
Yes, he does. He plays Killmonger.
He got Warner Brothers to enact an inclusion rider for every department. He said, we need to see a person of color, a woman, and out LGBT people in these things.
I think I should have to thank Michael B. Jordan personally.
Yes, you have the opportunity.
I'm making myself available for that, duty.
Michael, if you're watching the show, Chris would like to thank you in person. Any movies to recommend lately?
No, I saw Replicas with what's his name? I'm not going to think of his name off the top of my head. It was a very, very silly movie, so no, I can't recommend it. And I'm sure it's out of theaters by now.
Well, next week we'll have a review of True West, the play, and Anne will be back. We hope. And we hope to see you next week. But talk about how you're holding up. And we have 25 seconds. How are you holding up through all this nonsense that we're all living through?
Oh, I just eat a lot of popcorn and chocolate, and that medicates me.
I have turned to carbohydrates and the occasional glass of wine to do it, but I don't recommend it for everybody. But there seems to be some hope on the horizon, don't you think?
I think so.
Yes, so we'll see you next week. Bye.